Well, good afternoon. Ray introduced and stole a few of my sandwiches. Not least was a comment about dependence on liquid fuels, but also I actually, with 30 years in the Royal Navy as part of my career, I'm hoping I'm not about to prove that military intelligence is an oxymoron. But we can make that judgment later. Reducing the environmental impact in aerospace, we are, for the foreseeable future, dependent on liquid fuels and hydrocarbon fuels in aerospace, simply because of the slide that was put up on the last presentation in terms of fuel density. There is not a foreseeable solution, at least before 2040, and there probably need to be a couple of miracles between now and then, or massive changes in chemistry, before we can move away from dependence on liquid fuels in aerospace. That said, aerospace has an environmental conscience, being seen as the bad boy of contributing to the environment is bad for business. And so a number of the targets that we've taken on are voluntary amongst the sector. And there is also another driving factor which has been very instrumental in driving environmental impact of aerospace over the last 10 years, and that's been fuel prices. We did reach a stage at one point where about 48% of an airline's operating cost was fuel. And that has driven massive change in the industry in terms of bringing in new aircraft much quicker. It used to be that the average life of an aircraft in its primary user, i.e. probably the premier airline that buys the aircraft from new, was 25 to 30 years. You know, we saw the 747s going out of service only 4 or 5 years ago, and they were 30, 35, 40 years old. That average life is now down to 20 years and will continue to come down as technology, the pressure to improve efficiency and introduce new technology gets involved quicker. So if we can't do it by following the automotive industry and going electric quickly, what else can we do? Well, what I'm just going to cover today is a little bit about how have we set the targets, what targets have we set ourselves in the aviation sector, and then how are we going to go about it? Well, the first thing is, if you operate differently, if you fly less, or if you take off or land less, you can burn less fuel. And so we're looking very hard at how we change the way we operate. If you've got to burn fuel, then let's at least make it sustainable fuel. So we'll talk about use of non-fossil fuels. If you're going to have to do the journey anyway, let's do it burning as little fuel as possible. So what are we doing at the whole aircraft level to try and improve efficiency, and what have we achieved to date? Then we will touch on electric aircraft, because electric aircraft are a reality today, but there are limitations to their employment. How does that look going forward? How are we moving to the ideal scenario? And then a very quick summary at the end. So aerospace contributes 2% of the 3 billion tons of carbon dioxide generated annually by human activities. 2% of that is aviation. We generally end up as the poster child bad boy sector, but actually maritime is worse than us, and you know, we're all like to just, so the first target is, if you're in the spotlight, try and shed the blame. But you know, 2% is a lot, and we need to do something differently. How have we done to date? Well, each generation of aircraft, as we go through, and each generation now is generally about 8 to 10 years, each generation saves 15 to 20% on fuel and CO2 compared with its previous one, which would start to get us somewhere down towards our targets, except for the fact that aerospace use and travel, demand for aeroplanes and travel is increasing by about 4% a year. And therefore that very quickly negates those. If you take a 5-year cycle of 15% efficiency and you've increased your travel, your demand by 20%, clearly you're still going up. So the targets are complex, but they have been in place actually since 2009. So we, as a sector, we did recognize quite early. They were initially voluntary in 2009, but they've now been adopted by the International Airlines Transport Association, which is the industry body that is actually operating the aeroplanes. So you can see what the targets are there. Starting from a 2005 level, an annual improvement of 1.5% in terms of emissions, to by 2020, from 2020 onwards, a cap on net aviation emissions growth. So effectively, we're growing. We realize, or we've come to the conclusion that we can't contain the growth until 2020 because of the rate of insertion of technology. But from 2020 onwards, despite that continuing 4% growth, which is predicted to continue, we will cap our CO2 emissions. And then by 2050, relative to 2005, a 50% reduction in CO2. There's quite a set of complex targets underneath that. So within Europe, the EC is actually leading, and I'm desperately hoping that we stay part of the EC in this regard. Aviation is a global business. It's got much safer. All the comments that have been made since the engine accident 2 days ago, that was the first fatality in a large jet aircraft in over a year. So last year was the first year that there was not a single fatality in a large jet aircraft. That is all about what working globally has done for us in terms of improving our safety standards. And the same will be true of our emission standards. So from 2020, there's a new certification standard that will come in that will drive the next generation of aircraft, and will have some very rigid emission standards. And it will include a clause that by 2028, any aircraft that doesn't meet that certification standard will have to be taken out of production. So no more aircraft that don't meet that standard will come into the market after 2028. There are sub-targets to that. So under the European Convention, there's an initiative called Clean Sky, and that targets particular areas. So it reduces CO2 per passenger kilometre by 50% compared with 2000, target again at 2040 in this case, and reduce the output of the nitrous oxides, NOx, by 80%, because they're seen to be very damaging when you're injecting them into the atmosphere at high level. And then there's also a target on reducing perceived noise, because actually noise is another emission which is damaging to the environment, even if it's the human perception of it. So let's start with changing the way we operate. So again, this has been done under the EU, but under the Single European Sky air traffic management research arena. And it's all about optimizing takeoff and landing routines so that you actually you time your journeys and you set new profiles so that the aircraft climbs out and lands most efficiently. So you're not making continuous adjustments. If you make sudden adjustments in height, sudden adjustments to throttle settings on the engine, then that's when you start to use a lot of fuel. New separation techniques as the Internet of Things, and we're all a bit scared now after this earlier talks, but as that comes on, air traffic management systems become better and better aware of where aircraft are, the speed they're in, the height they're in, and their trajectory, then they can use new separation techniques to actually close aircraft up and therefore allow them to fly much more optimally. The target must be that we don't have aircraft circling over London at 6 o'clock every morning waiting to get into Heathrow. And then as we move on, we've heard talk about artificial intelligence, the system-wide information management system will create an air traffic management internet so that aircraft actually do talk to each other, they plan their routes, and effectively just know that when they take off, they're going to be able to fly from A to B in a straight line and land straight away at the other end. Now, they're a little way off, and all the cyber concerns that we've heard talked about earlier, you can be sure will be dealt with because we work in such a heavily regulated environment. But undoubtedly, that is the way to go. There are other things that are going on, though, in terms of the way we operate aircraft. The aircraft top left is the Airbus electric taxiing initiative, whereby the aircraft is actually, the jet engine operates most efficiently at high power. So when you're taxiing around on the ground, you're using a lot of fuel and producing a lot of emissions for no great benefit, because all you're doing is moving people around the airport. Far better then that you actually have the engine shut down in that case, and you run on electric power, battery powered, that can be recharged when you take off from the engine. Okay. The top right there is Qantas just in February made the first flight direct from London to Perth. If you take out landings and takeoffs on your long-range legs, then clearly that's much more efficient. The sensitivity of aeroplanes to weight in particular is really notable. To get from Perth to Sydney, Qantas are looking at things like thinner teaspoons to get the aircraft weight down. And there is a statistic that a tea bag carried on an aircraft for a year accounts for a litre of fuel. We are moving on then we're looking at sustainable fuels. Sustainable fuels are a reality. They are flying now. You see March 2016, United commenced daily flights using sustainable alternative fuel to LAX. And we've now reached the milestone of 100,000 commercial flights using sustainable aviation fuel. So we are trying to, and sustainable aviation fuel has a lower overall carbon footprint. Clearly the emissions it still puts out when it comes out the back of the engine are up there, but it brings them down. Mechanical technologies for improving efficiency are primarily focused around the engine, but they are also looking at different things on the aircraft as well. So the aircraft bottom right is an Airbus A340 with the outboard wing using what they call a laminar flow wing, which is like a razor-sharp wing that stops the boundary layer detaching, getting very technical. It's really an experimental one because it's so sensitive that literally a bug that's stuck on the wing will actually create turbulence and cause the boundary layer to detach. So the experiment is as much about can you actually maintain the laminar flow on a laminar flow wing as well as the impact on the aviation. The other two pieces there are both Rolls-Royce technology. The geared turbofan at the top, gearing the fan significantly increases the efficiency of the engine, but it does involve generation of huge amounts of heat. And so there's a big rig going on testing that. The fan that's involved with that should be in service by 2030 with an interim stage by 2025. And one of the things we talked about, the NOx emissions, one of the dilemmas is that to get more efficiency out of an engine, you try and operate at a higher temperature. But the higher temperature you have, then the higher the NOx emissions. So the slide in the middle there is a new combustor that is very intelligent and tries to maintain the temperature, but by changing the distribution of the heat in the combustor, then it reduces those emissions. And then lastly, we're talking about electric aircraft. So top left there, that aircraft exists. It's a two-seat trainer. It can fly for typically an hour's endurance. But then a very, very aggressive now lead by the airlines. So Norwegian have stated that they want every short-haul flight, i.e. within Europe, to be all electric by 2040. EasyJet are teamed up with an electric aircraft provider. Some very, very aggressive targets. Whether they'll be met or not, I don't know. But probably the most interestingly, in terms of moving towards long-haul and large jet, is the recently announced initiative between Rolls-Royce, Airbus and Siemens, where initially at least they're taking a four-engine regional aircraft and turning it into a hybrid commission with one of the inboard engines actually electrically powered, albeit with the power generation still a gas turbine, but in the fuselage and therefore running in the environment, in the ideal environment. So, a very quick gallop across the aerospace environment. It's not just fixing the aeroplane, it's as much about fixing the way we use the aeroplane. We don't yet have a foreseeable technology, and there isn't a battery chemistry today that even projecting it out will get us to long-haul, wide-bodied aircraft being all electric. But there's a number of things we're doing along the way that will get there, and I think certainly we'll see a significant impact coming in between 2020 and 2025, and then the move to more and more electric getting out to 2040. Thank you very much.